you're here. We know there are a bunch of people coming to us on Zoom on this, and we just thought because of the new protocols for COVID that it was much more wonderful to have people here in person. So rather than doing this whole thing over Zoom. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Debbie Whaley. I'm the pastor here at Mount Washington Presbyterian Church. And this is just a region of the country or the world that I happen to love dearly. I have a lot of deep connections, and we'll hear a little bit more about that. What I want to do is open us in prayer, and then we'll get started. And if you do have questions, try and hold them. We'll see if we have time at the end, but it would be great if we could. But welcome to all of you guys who are here. So why don't we have a prayer, and then we'll get started. So gracious God, we thank you for your Spirit who never stops working. And even in the midst of protracted conflict, we know that it's not the end of the story, that there is always a way that love can break through, that understanding can lead to a wisdom that helps us understand how someone else sees a particular conflict. And in this situation, seeing the other point of view is so difficult. So by the wisdom of your Spirit, help us to remain open to perspectives we may not have heard, to be open to how your Spirit may be leading us to respond. And by the grace that you have always extended to us, help us to see clearly how someone else may see something quite differently than we do. And we ask this in Jesus' name, amen. So let's just talk for why this region? Why should we have a talk on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? And for most of you, we think it's a religious fight. How many of you had to think about Palestinian-Israeli conflict would say it's largely a religious conflict? Okay. And how many of you would say it's been going on forever? Like more than, I don't know, maybe 1,000 years, 2,000 years? Yeah. You know, it's actually only been going on in this intensity for the last 100 years. This is actually not a historic religious fight. So we're going to find out a little bit more about that. So some of us wonder, like, how come we just can't get along? How come these people in this region can't get along? And why does it matter to us as Americans? And to be honest, we have spiritual roots in this region too. Just like you may have Muslim interests, you may have Christian interests, you have Jewish tugs that are related to this particular geography. And so we care about it in part because it's part of our history too. And then of course, some of you are here or interested just because of the recent conflict. Every time the Palestinian Israelis get in a fight with each other, everybody goes, oh my gosh, why did this happen? And then they go, I don't understand it. And I'm assuming that many of you are like me. I've also stood in those shoes. So this region that we're talking about here, this is Israel, right? This little map. And if I had my little marker would work, you would see where this is. The white part of that land is what is classically called modern day Israel. The gray area, which looks like a kidney bean, is the West Bank, which is on the west bank of the Jordan River. And the little area right here on the coast that's gray is what's called Gaza. And so when we talk about the occupied territories or the Palestinian territories or the West Bank or Gaza, those are part of what we call the occupied territories, and the white part is considered modern day Israel. And we'll talk a lot about what that means as we go through. But what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be talking about the Israeli narrative. And really, to be precise, what I'm talking about is the Jewish Israeli narrative. We talk about the Israeli narrative as if it represents all the people that are there in the land, but that's not true because 20% of Israeli citizens are Arabs. Okay, so I'm really talking about the Jewish Israeli narrative. Next time, I'm actually going to be talking about the Palestinian. I'm not going to make that distinction of Muslim Palestinian because Palestinian is a designation of an identity of a people group, not a religious designation. But then on the 23rd, I'm going to talk about the Palestinian Christian narrative. And that means that we're going to be looking at people who live in the West Bank, who are living under occupied territories, who are Christian, as well as Christian Israelis, Arab Israelis who are also Christian. So the only thing I can say is that it's very difficult to talk about this topic with and telling the whole story all the way, because as soon as you place one fact down, how all sides react to those facts change. So just for the sake of clarity, today what we're going to be doing is talking about the internal narrative of the Jewish-Israeli narrative that helped establish the state of Israel and perpetuates that understanding of the state. Next time, we're going to be talking about the Palestinian narrative, which is very different. They all see the same set of facts in different ways. And really, you cannot really understand this conflict if you don't come to both talks, because you need to understand how both of these viewpoints line up. So I just encourage you to hang in there with me. And maybe today you're going to go, I can't believe she said that. What about this? Well, you're probably going to hear another side to that next week, right? And then while you're hearing me say something next week, you're going to go, but what about that other point of view she talked about last week? So you sort of got to get into the headspace of each one of these narratives. So I just want to show you a little video that is talks about this, and I'm sure it will explain everything about the Palestinian thing in about 6 minutes. So here we go.
Okay, I'm finally in Israel. Of course, to understand today's Israel and the surrounding territories, you have to understand its history. This should only take a minute. By 1300 BC, settlers had created the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, who were conquered by the Babylonians, who were conquered by the Greeks, who were conquered by the Romans, who were conquered by the Byzantines, who were conquered by the Arabs, who were conquered by the Crusaders, who were conquered by the Ottomans, who were conquered by the British, who helped the dream of a Jewish homeland and were supplanted by Jewish refugees fleeing from Nazis, who were given an insane map for 2 new countries by the United Nations, followed by the declaration of the State of Israel, which led to a war with Arab nations, which led to thousands of refugees, a crisis with Egypt, another war with Arabs, an occupation, terrorism, Yasser Arafat, another war with Arabs, US aid to Israel, a settlement policy, a peace treaty, a war with Lebanon, a Palestinian uprising, a proposed peace treaty, an assassination, another Palestinian uprising, another war with Lebanon, more settlements, more terrorism, a separation wall, surging economic growth, negative economic growth, Hamas and the PLA versus Israel, Hamas versus the PLA, Israeli Jews versus American Jews, Israeli Orthodox Jews versus Israeli conservative Jews versus Israeli Reform Jews, Jewish and Arab men against Jewish and Arab women, more settlements, Bar Raffaelli, the Israeli-Gaza conflict, Israel hating Obama, Israel loving Trump, Israelis and Palestinians confused by Jared Kushner, 3 of the holiest sites in the world built on top of each other, plus Druze, Bedouins, Baha'is, and 1 Buddhist. All setting the table for a visit by me, Conan O'Brien. My mission is trying to make some people laugh, and in the process, alienate everyone. Okay, I'm finally...
Ever feel that way, guys? In all this, all of a sudden, all those facts get all mushed in together and you don't have any idea. And believe me, I've been in that place too. But in 2010, I went to Israel for the very first time. I went on a religious pilgrimage. And in that, I began being curious about this conflict because as the group that I went with, we read a book that was supposed to explain some of this, but I really didn't understand what I was seeing, and I didn't understand really very much about this. I have these, just like you, I have these vague markers in time that sort of coincide with various periods of my life that I really didn't understand what it meant. But since that time, I've visited a dozen times. I lived in Bethlehem during a sabbatical that I had, and I've become quite, at a basic level, I understand this conflict at a very basic level. I don't live this conflict. I don't have to be in the midst of all this, but as a result, I think I do have some insight into it. You guys will have to decide if that's good insight at the end of all of these talks. So, but it's a place that I love, and I have many, many friends and people there and connections there. Now, I used the word intentionally at the very beginning that we said we were going to explain a Palestinian narrative and an Israeli narrative. And today we're talking about that Jewish-Israeli narrative. But what does that mean? So when we talk about history and we talk about narrative, we're talking about 2 different things. When we talk about history, we're talking about an academic study of the human past that stresses sort of objectivity. It acknowledges issues of power. It even acknowledges in modern day scholarship the perspective or the social location of the historian and how that may impact how history is told. But generally, the historian is supposed to be an objective sort of observer, making meaning, but supposed to stand outside of the story. Where narrative is a very different thing. That's the stories we tell one another about ourselves. In other words, you know, there's certain things that happen in American history. That's the history part. But we have a certain narrative as Americans. How do we see ourselves as pioneers or whatever it happens to be? We have a narrative about what brings meaning to our particular group. Usually it's much more subjective. It has a sense of group identity and meaning. In narrative, you always define who the heroes are and you define who the villains are, right? When we think about that. And then we also, the stakeholder who's telling the story is often the protagonist. They're often the hero of the story, right? So think about it. That's just the way it is. So when we think about identity, creating that, that's that sort of thing that we get, maybe that's we receive, right? Your race or your ethnicity or your nationality or even the culture that's a part of that. You're given a language that helps you make sense of the world. Language is a very meaning-making endeavor. All those kinds of things are part of an identity that we have. And in the Jewish Israeli identity, that identity is actually part of the papers you carry around. It's a copy of an Israeli identity card. On this card, it tells anybody who would stop you, like, this is beyond a driver's license, everybody must carry one. It tells you your place of birth. It tells you your nationality. It tells you your religion is all part of this. So it's an identity card in its truest sense. But then we also have other identities that are sort of not just the ones that are given to us, but the ones that we sort of choose and navigate in our own world. Maybe, for example, if you're a Christian in our country, are you an evangelical Christian? Are you a Catholic Christian? Are you a Protestant Christian? Are you a progressive Christian or a conservative Christian? It's at that level that maybe you're negotiating and joining a particular group. And so the groups that we deal with, our identity often have to relate to our profession or to our religious sect, maybe things like ability, disability, our orientation, all that kind of stuff is all part of that. And let's look at what this might look like from an Israeli point of view. This is at the Western Wall, the most sacred place in all of Judaism. And you can see the different expressions here of identity. So the primary identity, every single one of these men is Jewish. But you can see one person with their hands up in great devotion who appears to be dark-skinned, probably very likely an Ethiopian Jew, next to a soldier who is praying, next to an Orthodox man who's praying, next to just some normal Joes with baseball caps on praying. So their vertical identity is that sense of they're all Jewish, but how they express their Judaism is part of that horizontal piece. And so the reason this is important for what we're talking about is that when I'm using the language of an Israeli narrative, I'm talking about a narrative that's developed at about 20,000 feet. There's a lot of diversity within that narrative of expressions of political thought, of religious understanding. And so I'm giving sort of this high overview, overarching narrative that many would embrace, but not all would embrace. So I just want to be really clear, but it is part of an overall general identity that Jewish Israelis would likely, for the most part, embrace. So when we look at these narratives side by side, we have the Israeli narrative and the Palestinian narrative. And if you just take a minute to look at that wordle, you can see how different things might mean things. Like we see the word Israel and Palestine, but we see on the Palestinian, we have the big word Palestinian. We also have British in there. Some of you may be going, what do the Brits have to do with this? On the Israeli side, we see words like Zionism or land. So there's all these different concepts that are going to come in to help us understand the internal narrative of either one of these groups. So let's be really clear about what narrative means. The narrative narrative of collective memory is partial. In other words, it's selective, and it's often distorted. It serves to foster group cohesion by appealing to existential threats. One's own group is both a hero and a victim, and the history of suffering and losses give weight to the righteousness of their cause. So how you perceive your victimization may then channel your passion for defending that point of view and the cause that you're fighting for. In contrast, the opposing group, the group that's over against you, is viewed as wicked, illegitimate, and responsible for the outbreak and continuation of the conflict. You guys want to see that again? Let's do this again. The narrative of collective memory is partial, selective, and distorted. It serves to foster group cohesion by appealing to existential threats. One's own group is both hero and victim. The history of suffering and losses gives weight to the righteousness of the cause. And in contrast, the opposing group is viewed as wicked, illegitimate, and responsible for the outbreak and the continuation of conflict. If you didn't want to apply this to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you could apply it to modern day politics right here in the US, right? We vilify the person who doesn't think like us, but we're the ones who are right. And we look at all the pieces that are coming, the information that's coming, and we handpick those that reinforce our point of view. So this is actually quite human, sadly and tragically, but it is. So we're going to be talking about Israel right here in the Israeli narrative. And this is a picture of the old city in Jerusalem. You can see it's sort of up in the center part, what's the Dome of the Rock. That's the platform and the mosque there, and then the old city that's surrounding all of that. And so this is really the heart of the conflict in many ways, is this little piece of real estate called Jerusalem that then expands out to the whole entire country. But again, what I'm talking about today is in particular the Jewish Israeli narrative. And when we talk about that narrative, we really need to start talking about Zionism. So Zionism is a political movement that begins in the late 19th century. It actually has started in the early 19th century, but it gets momentum in the late 19th century. And the person who really in modern day Zionism sort of catalyzes this whole process is a man named Theodor Herzl. He's an Australian journalist. He's a Jew, but he's a secular Jew. He actually has no interest in establishing a homeland for the Jews for religious reasons. He simply thinks that the Jews need a homeland because they're being persecuted all over the world, and believes that if they had a place where they could gather together, they could stand against the anti-Semitism that they're victims to all the time. And so he writes this article and about the solution to the Jewish problem. And he begins to, through his connections as a journalist, and then also just a savviness of connections within governments that had power at that time, he begins this establishing this movement called Zionism. They hold a Zionist Congress where they begin to talk about what the goals of Zionism would be. And again, at the very beginning, this is a secular Jewish movement. In fact, Orthodox Jews in places like New York and all over the world opposed this movement in the beginning because it was seen as secular and not having any religious roots. Here's a picture of Theodor Herzl on a boat. He's on his way to Israel with a group of people. As they're trying to establish this idea of a Jewish homeland in biblical Canaan. So as a political movement, remember this is late 19th century, early 20th century. They're piggybacking on the concepts of nation building and colonialization. This is at the height of empire building, although it soon begins to be broken apart. But the Jewish people, they're like, we want a part of this. We want to build a place where we can have an identity, a national identity, that means we would be protected and able to protect ourselves from the kind of persecution and anti-Semitism that they experience. And so while after some false starts, they actually, because remember, this is a secular movement at the beginning, at one point they want to put it, this Zionist state in Uganda. There's even talk of putting it in Alaska. There are other places in the northern part of Africa, which was controlled by Italy. So at first, because this is secular, they're just looking for a place. And even Hitler, and before the Holocaust, there was a rise of that movie, said that Madagascar, off the coast of Africa, was an island they were going to put all the Jews in. There's all sorts of ideas being thrown around. But at the end of the day, because of the connections to biblical Canaan, this sort of wins out as an ideology to be able to go home, back to their ancient homeland. And so Zionism, and it's not fully developed in the early days, but it becomes, if you looked at modern day Zionism, you would see that some of the arguments are that the Jews used to live there, that was their homeland, but they were forcibly expelled from the homeland by the Romans. And so it wasn't their fault that they were kicked out of the land. And even though they were kicked out of the land, there was always been a small presence of Jewish people in the land. Therefore, we can make a claim to this land and this real estate because we've always had a continual presence of at least one Jewish person, more than that, of course, has been affiliated with this part of the world. So let's just now go forward a whole bunch of time. We have the Ottoman Empire going on. And for those of you, it oversees as part of the Middle East for 500 years. And just to give you an idea of the Ottoman Empire, it's all that blue right in the middle is the Ottoman Empire. So you can see it envelops modern day Turkey, it goes to Syria, Iraq, all the way through the Middle East, and then down for large parts of Saudi Arabia, what we know then. But the Brits were not too happy with the idea of the Ottomans having this much power, and they'd had this much power for a long time. And so they want to break up the Ottoman Empire. And one of the things that they do is they form an alliance with the Arab tribes that are on the ground at the time. How many of you have seen Lawrence of Arabia? Or at least know the name, right? This is that very conflict. Remember, he's going and he's starting to dress in Arab gown. He's, riding with the Arabs and the tribes. He earns their trust and he makes these promises to them. And the promise was basically the Brits say, if you help us overturn the Ottomans, your overlords for all this time, we will provide you with the ability to be sovereign over your own land. You can be the kings of your own space, right? And so this promise was given to the Arabs in exchange for fighting against the Ottomans, and indeed the Ottomans do fall. And so we saw that. And so it is at the end of World War I, we have the establishment of France and Britain split up this part of the world, and we now establish the modern countries, or what will eventually be the modern countries of Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and the Republic of Turkey. And in this, they also established what's called the British Mandate of Palestine. Now, it's important to understand that the Arabs who are on the ground here, and we'll talk more about this next week, are a tribal people. They are not nationalists. They don't even have a Western understanding of nation building, but they're just sort of getting in on this idea. And they start taking on this idea and wanting to establish an identity for themselves as a national group. But they're fledgling in this, right? They really don't know what they're doing. And so France and Britain are very much all over this part of the world. So here you can see post-Middle East, you can see they established the Republic of Turkey. You can see Iraq, you can see Iran, you can see Syria, and you see in that orange sort of tan box, the British Mandate of Palestine. And this is how it's all split up initially. But then in about 1922, they actually split off and established the country of Jordan. And you can see that's in the green. And then this British Mandate of Palestine is really the area that we're concentrating on. And you can see that yellow part looks very similar to what the modern day geographical map of Israel is, right? Right? So this is now 1917, things begin to change, all right? And the Brits are going to have historic control over this part of the world until 1947. So for 30 years, they're going to be the major players in this land division that's going on, and how they're going to take care and manage the rest of this part of the world. So in 1917, though, well, the Brits are now, the war's over, they're splitting up the land over here, and you've got this British mandate. A man named Lord Balfour, who's the British Foreign Secretary, who has been talking to Theodore Herzl. Who's Theodore Herzl? Our founder of Zionism, right? And Lord Balfour is very, very inclined toward this idea of establishing a homeland for the Jews. He's very influenced by Herzl, and so he writes this memo, which is called the Balfour Declaration. And the beginning of this says, His Majesty's governments view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So this is the first time that the British government issues anything officially saying, we think there should be an establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. Okay? Just keep in mind, remember what was the promise they made to the Arabs at the same time, right? We're going to let you have sovereignty over your land. And at the time, the League of Nations, brand new League of Nations after World War I, ratifies this statement by Lord Balfour saying that there should be a Jewish homeland for the people and it should be established in Palestine. So here is this official sympathy. Lord Balfour writes to Lord Rothschild, and this begins this whole thing in 1917. Now at this time, now Zionism has some traction going on, right? they have now the support of the British foreign minister, who happens to oversee the British mandate of Palestine. Okay, that's a lot of power to have in, that's a really important person to have in your court. And so the Zionists at the time say, yes, our goals for Zionism are there should be a homeland for the Jews. We want to increase immigration to Palestine, to this British mandate of Palestine. And their initial commitment is that there'll be no disruption to the local people. We don't want to upend the local Arabs at all. And we're going to purchase all the land legally. So they go in and they just say, we're just going to immigrate. Let us come in. We'll legally buy the land. We'll begin to populate the land and do this, and we'll figure out, figure out how to live side by side with one another. Remember that there are Jewish Arabs in the land at this point. In fact, the Jews at this time in Palestine are of Arab. Arab is not an ethnic group. It's actually, it's more of a cultural identification. So all the Jews in Palestine that are there have been speaking Arabic for hundreds of years, right? Under the Ottoman rule. So they have a sort of an Arab identity. It's also Jewish, but now we have this wave of immigration that's going to come in, and they're not coming from other Arab countries. They're now coming from Europe, okay? So the British mandate of Palestine, this tension I mentioned begins to emerge because the Brits have promised their Arabs some autonomy, but they've also promised a homeland to the Jews, all in the same place, okay? And the Brits, frankly, go back and forth in all of this, and it's not worth going through that. If you ever want to, it's almost comical of who gets the ear of whoever's in charge of the mandate at that particular time, and they have all these commissions, and they begin to realize they have now set up this tension that they don't know how to resolve. It's it's sort of created a mess in this region of the world. And so among the things that I told you, the Zionists wanted to do immigration. And so in 1944, they instigate what's called the Million Plan, 1 million. In other words, 1 million immigrants, Jewish immigrants to Palestine. Now, there's only, in 1944, there's probably only about 700,000 people in this area. So this is a huge immigration plan, right? And they get this signed off by the person who's in charge of the British mandate. But then in 1947, Britain deports all those Jews back out of the country, right? And says they can't. So this is a picture of a boat that shows up on Haifa, which is a port in Israel, and they would not let them land and sent them all back. So this is what I'm talking about, this sort of back and forth. This happens in diplomacy and things like this. They just, the facts on the grounds change. So during this mandate, the Arabs become more and more concerned about this increasing Jewish immigration. They're not quite sure what the Jews are up to because they're still trying to figure out nation state building, right? The Jewish concern is that they're concerned that the Brits are reneging on their promise for a homeland, right? They've rightly said, we're moving ahead with your promises, as both sides have. And so the Jews and the Arabs both begin to target the Brits as well as each other, okay? So here's a picture of in 1946 or 44, the Jewish Irgun bombs the King David Hotel, which is the headquarters of the Brits in Jerusalem, okay? They're considered an underground Jewish terrorist organization that pulls this off. But then, not to be outdone, the Arabs also do a car bombing in Jerusalem just about 2 years later. So they're targeting British areas because everybody's mad at the Brits right now. And then they begin to have skirmishes with each other, which I won't go into, but just to say, now the tensions have escalated, and it involves violence and it involves terrorism on both sides. Now, what's emerging in Zionism is that they say that as they're pushing now for a statehood, that there was no previous Arab state. So they're not displacing anyone or establishing a state on the backs of someone else because there was no Arab state. Can you guys remember who was here before? The Ottomans, right? There was no Arab state. There was just the Ottomans. There were people there, but they were ruled by the Ottomans. Jerusalem can't be their state capital because Jerusalem was never a state capital for anybody because there was no nation, okay? The Jewish Israeli narrative would also say that the Arabs have no authentic or historic ties to the land. They came after the Jews had been promised the land in the biblical historical claim of Canaan. So the Arabs don't have a legitimate claim to the land. And then they also said that there was hardly anyone in the land at the time when they started this immigration project, and said that any Arabs that came into what was Palestine during this time, they came because they were exploiting the economic opportunity that the Jews who were migrating were offering. So again, this is what the Jewish Israeli narrative would say about Arabs in this period, okay? Now, then something happens that changes a lot of the dynamics. World War II and the rise of Nazism and the absolute evil of Hitler. And in this, we have concentration camps. And we have the Holocaust. Remember that there are only 16 million Jews at the beginning of World War II, and 6.2 of those Jews are murdered. 2/3 of all European Jews are killed. Think about that. Think about that. It is a genocide on a level that no one has ever seen. The suffering is not minor. It's unjustified and it's evil. So we have the Jews that were seeking a national place where they could experience protection, where they could experience where they could protect themselves from persecution, and that they would able to be protected from anti-Semitism. And from the time they begin and conceive this project to the end of World War II, this horrific, catastrophic, and evil campaign happens in Germany, where 2/3 of European Jewry is killed and murdered. Another aspect of this is that the Grand Mufti, who is like the lead Islamic cleric in Jerusalem at the time, sides with the Hitler and is involved in doing propaganda, encouraging Germans and Italians and others to undermine the Jewish claim to this homeland. You may have heard Netanyahu a few weeks ago made a claim that that the Grand Mufti actually suggested the idea of burning the Jews, and that's not true. But he did side against the European, like the Brits, the French, and the Americans in World War II, and was involved in an anti-Semitic campaign, aligning himself with Hitler. Post World War II, remember that no one wanted the refugees, the Jewish refugees. No one. We sometimes, when I talk about narrative, we rewrite our narrative so that we look like the heroes, but we forget that in America during World War II, there was incredible anti-Semitism here. And so we, like many other countries, said, oh, they're a problem. They're someone else's. It's at this point that everybody's got this problem. Where are we going to unload all these traumatized European Jews who are left, who've lost, many of them, the majority of their families? They've lost their wealth. What are we going to do with them? And so while we weren't responsible for the Holocaust, we all hold a responsibility of a lack of welcome to those who are just blistered and suffering from the horrors of the Holocaust. This is a picture inside of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. This is the Holocaust Museum there. This is the Room of Remembrance. And in this room are pictures of a sample of the pictures of the 6.2 million Jews that were killed. And you can see at the bottom, there's like these boxes, and they have biographies on every single Jew that they've been able to do research for. It's a very, very powerful experience to go in and sort of have this huge dome just filled with faces and people whose lives were lost in the Holocaust. And part of this, we see this emerging Jewish resolve that in the memory of those 6 million Jews, we will never allow this to happen to us again. You can understand that, right? This wasn't they weren't like, oh yeah, somebody, dissed me at the grocery store. This is a systematic genocide of their people based on their religious and ethnic heritage. And this becomes a very big driver now in the campaign related to Zionism. Prior to what we're going to see is the UN partition plan of how they split up this part of the world, 67% of the people in this land were Arabs at the time, and only 33% of them were Jewish. If you went back another 20 years, it would only be like close to 5% were Jewish. So they'd already experienced a huge wave of immigration, both Arab and Jewish immigration, but these are the numbers, right, in 1947. Land ownership was at 94.5% of the land was owned by the Arabs, and 5.5% of the land was owned by Jewish people. And here's the partition plan. So in 1947, the newly emerged UN is given the task of trying to figure out what to do with a British mandate, because the Brits now at this point realize that they just don't know how to solve the problem. So they give it over to this brand new international body. And this is what this body comes up with. The red areas are areas that they say that they want to give to the Jews in this country, and the green areas in this, and you'll see there's 3 blocks, they're going to give to the Arabs. And the yellow little circle in the middle is Jerusalem. And no one can decide what to do with Jerusalem, because Jerusalem seems to belong to everyone. It belongs to the Christians, it belongs to the Jews, and it belongs to the Muslims. And so they decide that Jerusalem, that little yellow center, somehow is going to be an international city. It's not going to have, it's going to have a sovereignty all of its own, sort of like the Vatican, right? It's sort of like its own little, enclave in the middle. This was going to be an international city. They didn't really decide who was going to oversee it, but that was their plan. You may be wondering why this kind of crazy gerrymandered map that they have. They had done some population analysis, and most of the Jews who had immigrated in these red areas to some degree, more so in the red areas than in the green areas that they had. So this is how they came up with this plan. We're going to see this map in a little bit, but pay attention, because this is the partition plan. And you'll remember those statistics I just gave you. 60%, 7% is Arab, a third is Jewish. Most of the land is Arab land. That means all of that red and green and yellow is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about here. Okay, so they split this land up into 2 states, the Arab and Jewish states. I said Jerusalem's an international city. But to effect this change in statehood, it would mean that they would transfer 225,000 Arabs off of their ancestral land and 1,250 Jews to make room for these states that would be made up of Arabs and Jews. And that this would involve a land transfer of 43% of Arab land to the Jews. So here's the partition plan again, just to get that in your head. And so in 1947, what happens, Britain withdraws from Palestine. The very same day, Israel declares itself a state that with accepting the partition plan, this partition plan, that their state would be in all these red areas. They declare themselves a state, but the Arabs reject this plan, and they reject even the concept of the state of Israel. And the Arab-Israeli war breaks out the very next day. And you can see why that possibly would happen, right? Because of this. They're talking about transferring about 30%, 40% of the Arabs off their land and giving away a lot of their land. Israel thought this was a really good deal. The Arabs not so much, which is why the conflict breaks out. The state of Israel makes news all over the world. This is a really big celebration that happens. And these are Jews celebrating in Tel Aviv, because the United States was the very first country that recognizes the state of Israel. The next day, war breaks out. Now in this, as war breaks out, this is the Israeli narrative, the Jewish Israeli narrative says that they believe that the Arab intent was to wipe out all the Jews. And you can imagine there are all those fledgling countries. Remember, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt to the south, all conspire now to go to war and believe that they are going to wipe out the Jewish people and reestablish this state as an Arab state. So this is the Jewish Israeli narrative, that they were intent to wipe out all the Jews. The Jews fought hard to avoid being massacred. Nothing like self-preservation to a group of people who had lost a major amount of their people, right? They fought like crazy and they won. And for defensive purposes, they said they needed to take more land than what the original allocation because they needed to have the safety berm because of the Arab hostility that's around them. And they say, and if it was actually impossible, no one would have predicted that this little fledgling group of Jews would be able to win against these Arab nations. They were so few against the many. And so it's a miracle. And so there becomes a religious sort of overlay to their winning independence. And this is pictures of the soldiers in Jerusalem celebrating their victory. And so this is also some of the, we're going to talk about the other narrative next week, but this is how they see some of the things I'm anticipating the counterpoint next week. They say that the Arab villagers who fled during the conflict fled of their own accord. They were not routed out of the villages. They left of their own accord. And then they say that the refugees who did leave can't come back for security reasons. Remember, if all the Arabs want to wipe out all the Jews off the face of the planet, you don't want to have them go back to their original homes because then they're going to cause us big security problems for us. And then they also say that this was completely the fault of the Arab leadership, because if the Arab leadership had accepted the partition plan as outlined by by the UN, none of this would have happened. If the Arabs had been compliant with the UN, there would not have been a war and there would not have been a conflict. This is a picture of refugees leaving their villages. And so what did Israel gain from statehood? They go from 5% ownership to 85% of the land, and increases in population. In 1947, there's 630,000 Jews, but there's 1.3 million Arabs. What I'm talking about in this land right now, it's all that red and green space and the yellow international city. And in 1948, the population changes from 716,000 Jews after the establishment of the state of Israel. But look at that other number, only 156,000 Arabs are left. So the Arab population goes from 1.3 million to 156,000. So increase from population goes from 32% to 82% of the population is now Jewish. So we have the establishment unequivocally of a Jewish homeland now in Palestine. Here are the new 1948 borders. You'll see the red is expanded. I don't know if you guys can see. You can see the old pink there. Sorry, it's not as clear as it could be. And so this is what the kidney bean is currently the West Bank that becomes a part of Jordan. The green part on the bottom in the south becomes part of Egypt. That's Gaza and part of the Sinai. And Jerusalem is now a divided city. It's split right down the half. You hear words like East and West Jerusalem. That's exactly what they're talking about. West Jerusalem now belongs to this red area of the state of Israel. And the green part is Jerusalem is split right down the middle, is under Jordanian control during this time. That makes sense? And in between all these is demilitarized zones. Right in the middle of the city, there's like city blocks that people who live in there couldn't live there anymore. They were had to be emptied out so that there was some sort of security berm between people. So here's the 1917 partition plan, and then the plan, and then what actually happens after the 1948 war. What does Israel gain? They finally get their safe harbor for persecuted Jews, a much needed safe harbor for persecuted Jews. They also immediately implement what's called the law of return, which means that they implement a law that says that any Jew in any part of the world can come to the land of Israel and establish citizenship immediately. So they don't have to have a historic tie to the land or anybody that they know that's lived there. Just by virtue of being Jewish, they can come and can make claim citizenship and have an identity as an Israeli. The Jewish people in that identity building phase that they're in, immediately towns are renamed with their biblical names in many cases, or in Jewish names. They're repurposed for however the Jews want them to be. The Arab villages, many of them are leveled by bulldozers or repurposed, and they begin a huge economic development campaign that's funded by largely American Jews. began to do this. They also began to take on the symbols of statehood and of identity. So they want to make sure that they're telling the story of resistance. Their religion takes a higher importance. They're talking about any situations that they can celebrate for national pride. They establish Hebrew as their unifying language. So no matter where you come from all over the world as a Jew, when you come to Israel, you were given Hebrew lessons because that was the unifying language that they wanted. They set up memorials. They start doing archaeology to sort of look at where the historic biblical claims could be that they can claim as their own and all of this. They're very, very intentional about building a narrative and an identity as Israelis very, very early on. In the very time you see, we've all heard about kibbutz. They have this collective farming. These are people who didn't necessarily were farmers, but they all begin to live in more socialist kibbutz and begin farming the land because they have to feed the people that come in here. They start making the desert bloom. They have water projects and all sorts of stuff to bringing water to areas that were water starved so that they can feed their people. But there's some things that happen in statehood that aren't realized. They have no access to some of their most significant religious places. One being the Wailing Wall, or what's called the Western Wall now. The Wailing Wall is, I'll show you a picture of it in a minute, but that's the iconic picture that you see of people praying. Like the picture I had earlier of those 4 Jews, it was called the Wailing Wall. They don't like that name now, but that's what it was called then, because the Jews would go there to lament. The tomb of the patriarchs, they had no access to that. That's in Hebron. That's where Abraham and Sarah and Jacob and Rebecca, or Isaac and Rebecca and Jacob and Leah are all buried, and they had no access to that. There's a mosque built over that as well as a synagogue now. They didn't have access to Rachel's tomb. They didn't have access to their religious symbols like Shechem or Shiloh or Jacob's Well, among others. They also, in the fighting in 1948, the historic old, part of the old city, there's 4 quarters to it, and there's historic Christian, Muslim, Armenian, and Jewish sections in the old city, the old walled city. And the historic Jewish quarter is burned to the ground in the war. And so that's destroyed and they have no access because that part is in East Jerusalem. The Wailing Wall is in East Jerusalem. They also experience increasing hostility from their Arab neighbors, who many of whom have not until the peace talks until the 70s and 80s began to even talk about recognizing Israel's right to exist. And you also need to know that the Arabs at this time start expelling all of their Jews that live in their countries, expel them from their countries, and they end up in Israel too. So they're mutually mad at everybody. Everybody's getting mad at everybody. And the Arabs are like, well, we don't want any Jews in our country now. So they kick them all out. And then the 6-Day War happens. And there's a lot that happens between now and then, but we're just going to jump ahead to the big points. The 6-Day War happens in 1967. In 6 days, they're able to rout out and sort of destroy quite a few of the Arab armies. It starts with an attack in Egypt, where they, in just minutes, decimate the Egyptian Air Force. And in this time, Israel occupies now what's called the Golan Heights, the West Bank, our kidney-shaped area that was run by Jordan, and all the pink stuff at the bottom, which is the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza. The Golan Heights is up at the very top. You can see it. I wish my pointer would work. But up in the top, that pink area is the Golan Heights. That's in modern day Syria. This is where Bill was stationed as part of his military service. And the reason that this is so significant is that they gain the water rights to the Jordan when they take over the Golan, which is a very big part of this part of the world. Water is everything. And they also gain a strategic military defensive because of the way the mountain ranges are done. They now have access to the highest points. They can now, instead of their enemies at the top of the mountain looking down at them, they now are at the top of the mountains looking down over being able to protect themselves. They also gain control of the Sinai and Gaza, which was important for them for strategic military defense. And they also control now the West Bank, which now there starts to emerge a growing ideological claim to all of Judea and Samaria It means they also have increased security and they have additional natural resources. I'm going to go back to that map just to show you. So that kidney bean right there, there's a mountain range that runs right through the middle of it. So that means now they have the high advantage, but on the, wow, oh, never mind. On the right side of that picture where it borders Jordan, you can see the Jordan River. That's a broad valley that has an enormous strategic military defensive potential, because it means Jordan would not be able to easily invade Israel. And remember, none of these people have treaties that they have now going on. So now after the 1967 war, they have access to all of Jerusalem. They now have access to their historical sites, including their old Jewish quarter in the old city, which they rebuild. And now they start claiming that they can want to establish an undivided and unified capital of Jerusalem. I had another picture in here. Oh, well, anyway, they start making use of their symbols. This is Masada, which had been excavated right before the 67 war began to be, but this ideology that those Jewish holdouts in 70 AD when Jerusalem's devastated, they stand up against the entire Roman army that builds a ramp to come up and find them, and they all commit suicide. And that the saying is, it's better to die than to be enslaved. And so this never again attitude begins to become really a part of their national identity. We will never let anyone persecute us, cause us harm in any way. We're never going to allow the Holocaust to be repeated. Well, this is a picture of the Wailing Wall right here. So you can see it's just a little narrow valley. This is before 1967. And so here are Jewish people praying at the wall. And then once after 1967, they blow out this whole territory and make this huge, incredible plaza square where military and all sorts of national rights are held here. And you can see that's the Western Wailing Wall, which you can see the Dome of the Rock on top, and where those trees are right behind that is Aqsa Mosque, is where a lot of the confrontation has been happening. So the third most religious site for the Islam is that Dome of the Rock and that mosque up there. The number one most holy site for the Jews is right here on the wall, the retaining wall that holds up that platform. So we're talking about lots of interreligious challenges right here. And so here's the new map. We have our one on the one side is the partition plan. The middle one is 1968. And then the pink now is what happens in 1967. All of that pink land comes under Israeli military oversight. So the Israeli military technically occupies this land. And even to today, not all of this, but most of that pink land is under military law, not civil law, but military law. So let's talk about the Arab hostilities and terrorism. So the Jewish-Israeli narrative is that Arabs have no recognition of Israel or have very limited. The PLO and the intifadas that come in the next 20, 30, 40 years. You remember some of these? Munich, 1972. I mean, I still remember how horrified I was to see the Palestinian terrorists take those Olympic athletes. We have plane hijackings. How many of you remember those, right? That's when we started having TSA, right? And things like that because of hijackings. Then we start seeing a rash of suicide bombs. Most of this is happening in 72 was the Olympic athletes hijackings. The first one was 1970 to 1983. And suicide bombs are now happening starting in the 80s. And there was a cluster at one point for several years, and then more limited sort of suicide attacks or whatever are happening. But you can imagine to a people who have their forming identity story as they establish the state of Israel was never again will we let people persecute us or terrorize us. And here we have Palestinians, and we'll talk about their narrative next week, but are doing things that really are terrorizing their people. And so as a result, Israel's resolve to contain the Palestinian problem becomes even more intense. Then we have in Gaza, we have Hamas, which is democratically elected. We'll talk about that next week, but they actually, in their charter, part of their charter is to annihilate Jews and remove Israel from its sense of being. So while eventually the Palestinian Authority does recognize Israel's right to exist, Hamas never has, and they've been categorized as a terrorist organization, and it's Hamas is the governing political power in Gaza. And so this is where all these conflicts happen, where they're shooting rockets off, and that kind of stuff comes from that group. And then you have Hezbollah, which is in Lebanon, which is made up of a group of Palestinian refugees that left in 1948 that congregate in refugee camps in Lebanon, and they eventually form a political faction that's called Hezbollah that you probably know is funded by Iran. And so Iran is also bent on the destruction of Israel. So Hezbollah in the north is a threat to Israel on that border, and then Gaza on the coast and in the south is a threat to Israel in the south. So here's a picture of a suicide bombing, one of the bus bombings in Tel Aviv. Here is a woman being whisked away after one of these bombings. And some of you have read a book called The Lemon Tree, and I'll never forget Dahlia, who's one of the main protagonists, talking to me about being a young woman a young married woman in Jerusalem with a son who was like 6 or 7 years old at the time when one of these bombings went off, and her absolute terrified fear that what would happen to her son. She's telling this story 20, 30 years later, and you can still feel the emotion of her fear. So I can't explain to you enough the threat of terrorism that triggers the post-traumatic response of an entire people is very high within the Israeli understanding and self-understanding of who they are. And so they say, look, we have the right to defend ourselves. And so as early as 1994, as some of these suicide bombings happen, they begin the security wall project, which means they are now separating the West Bank, that kidney being, and also Gaza from the mainstream Israeli population. So for security reasons, they begin to build a wall. They also begin to take advantage in all of this of the natural barriers, mountainsides, land as protective hedges. They detain and interrogate Palestinians, especially those in the West Bank, because remember, they're under military rule. They don't have to obey the same civil laws that they do in Israel proper. And they begin to detain and interrogate people as a way of sometimes anticipating terror and sometimes in response to terror. And there's this huge fear within the Jewish Israeli population that the Arab Israelis in Israel, remember, they're 20% of the population, will side with Palestinians. So you may know that military service is compulsory in Israel. It's compulsory for Jewish Israelis, unless you're ultra-Orthodox, and then you can get waived out of it. But for many, many, many years, only in like the last 5 years, have they allowed Arab Israelis to join the military, because there was a feeling that if you had an Arab Israeli in the army at a checkpoint, he might see his cousin or a friend and would side with the Palestinians and not be loyal to the state of Israel. So there's deep suspicion within the Jewish Israeli population to the Israeli Arabs who are full Arab citizens in Israel because of this concern of the overall narrative that Arabs would love nothing more than to rid the world of Israel. And so these are the kinds of images that often evoke trauma within the Israeli perspective. This is a Palestinian protest. You see the Hamas flag in the sort of yellowish green in the back. Because of the way the society is, almost all the people who are ever protesting in Arab society are men. You don't see a lot of women. And so they have a sort of almost an innate fear of Arab men gathering because of just this sort of unbridled sort of fear of the violence that could come about. Some of this fueled by terrorism that happened in the past, and some of this fueled just simply by fear and racism, to be honest. But a fear the fear has some basis in rational thought because the nations around them and the people around them still have a very strong Jewish and anti-Israel rhetoric, and that still continues to today. So here's a picture of the security wall that they build. This is a picture of the wall with a military tower at the top. The entire kidney beam on the western side, and not in the Jordanian side, is all, this wall exists all around. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles of the security wall. They've also been very afraid recently, this picture of the most recent Gaza aggression, where Gaza is shooting off rockets into Israel. They have a huge, spend a lot of money, and America helps them with this, for a defensive system, because Israeli towns are right up next to, near the Israeli, next to the Gaza border. And so these rockets pose a threat. And then we have in the 1967, I said there was an ideological movement of people claiming Judea and Samaria, that whole kidney beam being, that's part of our historic biblical claim to the land. And so the settler movement begins, which they say all of Judea from the river, which is the Jordanian River, Jordan River, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea should be owned by Israel. So all of that kidney beam should just be part of Israel. They also begin to establish settlements up in the Golan Heights, as well as in East Jerusalem, which was Arab, and then in the West Bank, which is the kidney beam, and they also establish settlements in Gaza. They eventually withdraw the settlements out of Gaza in one of their peace agreements, but there are settlements in Golan, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank, which are big parts of the conflict now. And some of the reasoning for these are not only ideological, but for security. And so in 1983, part of the master plan for the development of Samaria and Judea, they said they wanted to move large swaths of the Jewish population into the West Bank. And so you often hear about this word settlement, right? Like they have to withdraw from the settlements or what, and this all has to do with establishing what are the borders, what would be the borders of a future Palestinian state and what would be the borders of Israel. But I just want you guys to know this is part of the official government plan, is to actually move Jewish population into this area. And so to become a settler and move in here, the government incentivizes you, and it's economically great for you to move in. You get subsidized housing. You are completely separate from any Arab communities. You're secured by the military. You have settler-only roads that even though they travel through parts of the West Bank, Arabs are not allowed to drive on them. They provide infrastructure within these settlements of roads and water and all sorts of stuff. And currently there are about 650,000 Jews that live in these settlements in the West Bank. And here's an example of one. You can see the perimeter around this is sort of started. This is up in the northern part of the West Bank, but you can see a highly evolved infrastructure in here. Many of the settlements have businesses and business, what do you call them? Business zones or whatever, which is where I'm not going to go into it, but anyway, this is what a typical settlement would look like. You can see sort of the outlying sort of agricultural land around it. And so you go in, you establish a settlement, you make a claim for that, and then you build a community around it. The largest community in Israel is about 120,000 people in one of these settlements, including a full university. So there, I mean, some of them are quite huge, some of them are small. They might only have a few, like maybe a dozen mobile homes on them that they eventually will expand. This is what the settlements look like in the West Bank. This is just showing you the location, all the blue dots, and I wish you guys could see a little bit better, but you can see how far in around these settlements are. On this map, the yellow roads are settler-only roads, meaning that Palestinians in the West Bank can't travel on them. And that big yellow part that's on the right side of this map that goes down the Jordan River, that's all the Jordan Valley. And that's all under Israeli military control. And so they have displaced villages within this since 1967, and this is considered a military zone, the yellow part. So they've moved in settlers also for all of this. So you can see just there's clusters and clusters of these, and it's surprising how far into the West Bank they are. So this is one of the biggest contentions in the conflict of whether or not they can establish a two-state possibility because of how these settlements impact the Palestinian cities around them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next month or next week. But anyway, that's just an idea. Is that surprising to you to see the number? And some of them, like I said, are small. So just to think about the demographics, there's 9.2 million people in Israel. When I'm talking about Israel, I'm not talking about the West Bank or Gaza, just Israel proper. And of those, 74% currently are Jewish. So about 21%, 20% are Arabs, so Arab Israelis. And then there's about 5% or 0.5% that are just mixed, like the international community and all that kind of stuff. To look at it from the West Bank, there's 3.5 million people in the kidney bean of the West Bank. 2.9 million are Arabs, but there's 0.6 million Israeli settlers. So almost 20% of the people that live in that West Bank area are Jewish Israelis. And just in case you wanted to know, the population of Gaza is about 2 million people. And they do not have any Jewish settlers living within Gaza. Okay, before I go into this next place, I just want to break before I tell you the next part. Anybody have any questions or anything they want to ask? I know this is a lot of information. Yeah, Gail. So nothing about Winston Churchill and all that stuff? Just because we're talking about a really high level process here. So, yeah. Yeah. You could write an entire 700-page, 1,000-page book on almost every year in this conflict since about 1910. I mean, it's amazing, all the pieces. So you're right. So I want to talk about something because this is where more recently in Israeli politics and the tensions are sort of increasing between Israeli Arabs and Jewish Israelis. And so what's difficult is that just several years ago in 2018, the Knesset, their highest governing body, passed what's called the nation state law. And what this says is that Israel, and this is from the statement, these are word for word, the land of Israel is the historical homeland for the Jewish people in which the state of Israel was established. And the state of Israel is the national home for Jewish people in which it fulfills its natural, cultural, religious, and historic right to self-determination. What this law does is it says that Israel is a Jewish state, not necessarily just a democratic state. When it was founded as a Jewish homeland, but it was understood within a democratic understanding of how they would organize themselves. And they did not, in the original basic laws of Israel, privilege Jewishness over Arabness or over Muslim. Remember going back to the original goals of Zionism when I said that they didn't want to disrupt the locals? In the early days of Zionism, that was part of the ideology, but that's shifted. And so when they say that the state of Israel is the natural home of the Jewish people, and it gives them the historic right of self-determination, what they actually mean is it's giving them the right of self-determination over their other citizens. So this is what is in part now in the current conflict also exacerbating an already tender situation. It means that they have the right, this is the Jewish people, have the right of self-determination in the state of Israel, which is unique to the Jewish people. Okay? And Jerusalem, they say, is the complete and unified capital of Israel, which goes against the idea of a two-state solution where the Palestinians would like to establish East Jerusalem as their state. And the state's language is Hebrew. And why this is complicated is because during the British Mandate, there were 3 official languages: Hebrew, Arabic, and English. And so how this is perceived by the Arab Israelis is that this privileging of the Jewish people religiously and ethnically over against the others. From the Israeli perspective, the Jewish Israeli perspective, this is only now making clear what had been the intention from the beginning. This is a Jewish homeland. And so part of their reason for this law is to establish their unequivocal right to, regardless of what happens in this country, to maintain this as a Jewish homeland. Here are some other things. The state will be open for Jewish immigration and the ingathering of exiles. This means that, again, this whole idea of aliyah, or that any Jew from any part of the world can come and establish citizenship in Israel. And in fact, many people establish dual citizenship, where they have citizenship in their country of birth, but also are immediately granted Israeli citizenship. And many of these expats vote in their elections. The state will strive to ensure the safety of the members of the Jewish people in trouble or in captivity due to the fact of their Jewishness or their citizenship. So part of the charter of Israel now is to protect Jews all over the world beyond their borders. And then they will act within the diaspora, which means any of the Jews that are not in Israel, to strengthen their affinity between Israel and the Jewish people. In other words, they're going to use the state as an identity building project, and they will act to preserve the cultural, historical, and religious heritage of the Jewish people, even beyond the state of Israel. These two parts here have really upset a lot of American Jews, to be honest. This has not been popular in some of the more progressive Jewish parts of the United States, because they don't feel like the state of Israel should be able to impose its will beyond its own borders. And also because the state of Israel is still governed by religious rules. So for example, to marry in Israel, that's all overseen by the rabbinic court. It's not a civil, it's actually a religious piece. So there's tremendous concern that as Israel has gone more religious right, for example, Tel Aviv, which is a very secular city, but Jerusalem, which isn't, the state was wanting to impose a mandatory Sabbath across the whole entire country. And people in Tel Aviv are like, what are you talking about, right? You can't impose that on us. So there's fear in these communities beyond that if Israel says this, they're going to preserve their religious and cultural and historic heritage, that they will begin to say that this has to be imposed beyond the boundaries of Israel. Yeah. Yes. They're part of this nation state. The Jews that live in the West Bank are full Israeli citizens and are governed by civil law. They're not, the settlers in the West Bank are under civil law. The Palestinians in the West Bank are under military law, military occupation. So yes, they're considered, they would be part of all of this. So yeah. And then this last one is the state views the development of Jewish settlement, going back to the settlement, as a national value and will enact to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation. So just so you know, just to an Arab Israeli, this was like, you just slapped me in the face. Am I a second-class citizen? You just told me that everybody in this whole country that's Jewish has more privileges than I do. And so when we're going to talk a little bit about the current fight, this is part of what's underneath, sort of the cultural stuff going underneath. I just wanted to give you some pictures of the diversity of Judaism. These are Hasidic Jews in the old city of Jerusalem. These are more secular kids doing Hanukkah candles. And this is a Jewish ceremony of two men getting married. So Judaism, just to be really clear, is not singular. It has as many expressions as you would expect to find in American Christianity, or frankly, in global Islam. There's many, many expressions of it. And this preservation of Jewish identity and heritage is broad and diverse. So let's look at the current conflict. Sheikh Jarrah is an Arab village that's in East Jerusalem. Okay, let's get our thinking caps on here. East Jerusalem was under Jordanian control until 1967. It's part of Jerusalem that was split in 1948, okay? And half of the city belonged to the Arab population of Jordan, and the other half of the city belonged to the Jewish part of the population. Sheikh Jarrah is an Arab village within East Jerusalem, okay? This is where the challenge happens. When in 1948, when the city was split, there were Jews that were on the East Jerusalem side that had to migrate over to the west side, just like there were Arabs on the west side that had to migrate over to the east side. What they're saying here is that the Jews who lived in some of this, in Sheikh Jarrah, before it was an Arab village in 1948 have the right to return to their property. Okay. And so what they say is they had prior ownership of that land before 1948, and therefore they have the right to now claim that land. And that's the case that's before the Supreme Court. And for the families that are in Sheikh Jarrah that are being displaced, say, I've lived in this since 1948. Jordan granted me the right to this land. How can you kick me out? Now, you may wonder about the status of someone who lives in East Jerusalem. We'll talk about this a little bit more. Those Arabs who live in East Jerusalem are not automatically given Israeli citizenship, even though they claim Jerusalem is the unified and undivided capital of Israel. Arabs that live in East Jerusalem are considered residents of Israel, and they do not have the same civil rights as Arab Israelis that live in other parts of Israel. And so this is part of the challenge, is where do their rights fit into this story? So then the Jewish Israeli narrative says because they owned that land before 1948, just because the war intervened, or because between 48 and 67, that land belonged to Jordan. And then even if you've been living there since 1948, it still belongs to us because we have the right to that deed. It's really important that you pay attention to this, because next week when we talk about the Palestinian narrative, we're going to talk about how it works in reverse. But for the case of this side of the narrative, that's the basis of why they're kicking these Arabs out of Sheikh Jarrah. They say we have the legitimate right to this property. And this is some of the protesters in Sheikh Jarrah. You can see the Palestinian flag and the Israeli flag as they're contending over these homes. And this is a struggle, which you'll understand more next week. We talk about the Palestinian narrative, of why land ownership in all of these ways that they get configured and the rights that are given to each group. And lots of groups have, depends on where you are in the status of the hierarchy of status, how you're treated, particularly related to land ownership. And so the Israelis would say, Jewish Israelis would say, no, the Jewish people have the right to this land. Palestinians have no skin in this game. And that's partly what was erupting before Ramadan this week. So what happened is you have the Sheikh Jarrah thing happening, there's protests going on. Then you have one of the highest holy days for Arabs, or for Muslims, not Arabs, for Muslims is Ramadan. And it's a whole month. They fast all during the day, then they gather in the evening to break the fast together. It's usually celebratory and wonderful. Lots of people go to prayers and their high holy places. And where do you think, if you live in Palestine, your holiest place to go worship would be? At your third most holy spot in the whole entire world, which is up at the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, okay? They're going to gravitate to their most holy place for their highest holy day, right? So outside of the old city of Jerusalem is this place called the Damascus Gate. It's a big public square. And this is a place that Palestinians or Arabs, Palestinians, whatever you want to call them, Arabs, Muslim Arabs gather during Ramadan to break the fast. And so they limited access to this. And the reason they did is because historically pro-Palestinian protests and anti-Israel protests happen in the Damascus Gate. And so if you're trying to protect your people, you don't want a bunch of people who are all hot-headed about a bunch of stuff gathering in a protest, right? There also was increasing concern, if you've been following the news in Israel, and they talk about forming a coalition government. And before the conflict happened, with this little war with Gaza recently, there was an increasing, for the first time, there's an Arab bloc within the Knesset that never gets empowered by the government. Nobody wants to negotiate with the Arabs for good reason, for the reasons we've talked about. And so, but they were starting to be in negotiations to be part of forming this new government. And there was increasing fear within Israel. And then there's also this underlying fear of large groups of Arab men gathering together because of those violent pictures I showed you a while ago. And when you get all those things together, if you're in charge of security, you go, I don't want a powder keg gathering. And so they limited access to the Damascus Gate. And this is what the Damascus Gate looks like. It's a big amphitheater, and this is where the doorway is where you go into the old city of Jerusalem, the walled city of Jerusalem, where the Arabs would coming from East Jerusalem. This is one of their main portals, would have entered into this gate for commerce, and then eventually making their way up to the mosque and to the Dome of the Rock. So what also is happening at this time is that the Israeli military storms Al-Aqsa Mosque. The crowds, which are mostly male, that worship there, there's not a lot of women that go to church, so to speak, for their Friday. It's Friday afternoon. It's when they go to hear the sermons. The sermons are often pro-Palestinian. Large crowds of male Arab Israelis. They often during this time will actually limit the age group. They will not allow men that are like from the ages of 18 to 35 because they're worried about having this particular age group gather together at the mosque. And they would linger after their prayers, which get everybody all riled up, and because they were protesting what was going on in Sheikh Jarrah. And so they storm the mosque as a security measure. Now, this is just an idea. This is outside the mosque. This isn't, that's all, I don't know how many, those are all Arab men praying during Ramadan. We're talking, I mean, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people are up on this thing. And the mosque, which is huge, is packed full of people. So you can imagine that if these folks get riled up, if you're Israeli security, you're going to be a little concerned. The problem is that when you storm the most holy place of a people, you get them even more riled up. Imagine what would happen if at Easter at church, the military came in on us. We would be horrified, right? So there's a security issue going on from the Israeli point of view, but this also inflames the situation from the Palestinian point of view, which we can talk about more next week. And then on top of all of this, we have Jerusalem Day, which is related to when the Israelis celebrate their independence. And so on Jerusalem Day, people run through the streets celebrating and parading and talking about Jewish sovereignty over Jerusalem. They parade through the Arab Israeli neighborhoods, and they end with a celebration at the Damascus Gate, the very place where the Arabs are not allowed to gather. This celebration has become increasingly anti-Arab in its flavor, and it's a flashpoint with the Arab Israelis who feel like the parade that they have through their areas is like sticking, your finger in your eye, right? Because they're basically saying, nanny, nanny, go, we won, too bad for you. And so here's a picture of Jerusalem Day. Again, a bunch of Israeli, usually younger men, oftentimes ultra-Orthodox, all parading through the city, claiming this. And so we have Sheikh Jarrah, we have Ramadan, we have the closure of the Damascus Gate, and now we have Jerusalem Day, and they're all happening on May 10th. Isn't this exciting? Yeah, this is all happening at the same time. So for an Israeli point of view, they have the right to preemptively protect Jewish people and property. So part of the things that they do is not necessarily always because they've been provoked at first. They actually preemptively will protect their people and property. They feel like they have the right to defend themselves against actual violence. So when Hamas starts throwing rockets at them, they feel like they're provoked and they have every right to defend themselves. So why Israel? To a Jewish person, the Arabs don't want to coexist with Israel. This is the main narrative that is in the Jewish Israeli mainstream, and that there's no reliable partner for peace because they have no intention of ever wanting us to exist. There's also a narrative within the mainstream Israeli thought that Arabs are not only hostile, but they want to eliminate us. They also say we have become the safe harbor for persecuted Jews, and we're never going to forget what happened to us, and we're never going to allow it again. So we have every right not only to defend ourselves, but to preemptively rout out any sense of anti-Semitism or persecution that we find. And then part of their narrative is we may be victims, but we are now the victors. This is part of undoing the Holocaust narrative, is to say, yes, that happened to us, never again, and we will arm ourselves and defend ourselves and never, ever come out on the short end of a conflict anymore. Now, without a lot, right? So this is the Israeli narrative, and next we're going to talk about the Palestinian narrative and all the major events that we talked about and a few others that they would emphasize. It's going to tell those facts from a very different point of view. I can't encourage you enough to say come to both. If you come today, come next week. Then on the 23rd, I'm going to be talking about the Palestinian Christian narrative, and we'll get there. But what I want to end with today is a story about a man that I know up in Galilee. His name is Dory. He's a Jewish Israeli man. He's a captain on one of the boats that sails around the Sea of Galilee. And I met Dory when I was on the Sea of Galilee. I was on my sabbatical, and I was with a friend of mine who was living in Turkey at the time, and we were visiting, and we didn't even know how you got on a boat because I've always been part of a tour group. So we just went down to the docks and talked our way onto Dory's boat. And Dory sat there. He said, well, we're not leaving for about a half hour. So he said, why don't you sit with us? So we sat with them, and he and his crew. And he did lots of crazy things. Like he read our horoscopes, and we got talking about stuff, and we became friends. So Dory, as I often ask people there, I said, Dory, so tell me, what do you think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Just interesting. I ask a lot of people that question because I'm always curious what they'll say. And Dory sat there and thought for a minute. He goes, you know, this has been my home my entire life. He said, every day I get up, I don't have a better job than to get up and be here in this most beautiful place. I'm on the Sea of Galilee every day. It's beautiful. It's great. It's wonderful. This is my home. It's the only home I've ever known. And he said, but to be Jewish in this area means that none of my neighbors want it to be my home. He said, I belong here. It's as much my home as anywhere has ever been or ever will be, but nobody wants me here. And I thought that was really a poignant way of just an ordinary guy sharing his perspective on this idea that he feels a connection to this land, to this place, to the history, and yet he feels that if given a choice, all of his neighbors would wish he'd move out of the neighborhood. And I think that really does sum up sort of the Israeli narrative. We have a right to be here. We want to be here. We've established ourselves here, but nobody else wants us here. And as long as they're going to perpetuate any kind of violent talk or violent action against us, we're going to defend our right to be here, to stay here, and to thrive here. So that's the Israeli narrative